Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth.
I truly believe that thoughts are the greatest vehicle to change.
We do not care whether the cat is black or white, as long as it can catch mice.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favorite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, and as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can, is a quote from the Irish dramatist, critic, and Nobel laureate George Bernard Shaw, whose influence on Western theatre and culture continues to live on. I thought this was a fitting quote for our guest today, a leader of an organisation that helps shape communities through a commitment to creating places for good and inspiring experiences. Our guest is Anthony Boyd, Chief Executive Officer of Fraser's Property Australia, one of Australia's leading diversified property groups, part of the Singapore-listed Fraser's Property Group. Anthony initially joined Fraser's Property Australia in 2005 and progressed through senior leadership roles and was Chief Financial Officer prior to his appointment as CEO. He also represents Fraser's Property on the Property Council of Australia's Corporate Leaders Group and the Champions of Change Coalition. Hello and welcome to another episode of No Limitations, a show where we speak to elite world-class performing men and women and unlock the secrets and influences that have shaped their destinies and that you could apply to your own life. For our first-time listeners from all over the world, please don't forget to follow on your preferred podcast platform and share with your friends and colleagues. And for our listeners in Italy, Canada, and Singapore, a big hello. I am your host, Greg Robinson, Managing Partner of Blendon Partners, Executive Search and Board Advisory. In today's episode, we are treated to some fascinating stories from Anthony's career. From a young man playing rugby in Hong Kong to now at the helm of a leading property group with a rich heritage going back to almost 100 years, and moving forward, setting the standard for outcomes for innovation, the community and sustainability. He shares with us insight into high performance and leadership, the human connection, inspiring passion in others, and the mindset to achieve. So sit back and enjoy. Best effort, right attitude. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Greg. Nice to be here.
Anthony, what's your one golden rule for living a high-performance life? And when opportunity comes in many disguises, how do you actually seize it?
Yeah, I think the high-performance life thing, look, my secret would be you need to spend as much of your time as possible doing things you're passionate about. It doesn't have to be just the one thing. It can't just be work or whatever it might be. But whatever that is, I just don't think you're ever going to be at your best unless you're emotionally invested. In terms of the opportunity thing, I think this is all comes down to your own preparedness to be ready for an opportunity. For me, it's sort of two things, and I use this phrase often, but it's having the effectively making sure that you've got the right attitude and your best effort. So it's all about attitude and effort. If you've got that right setting and that right mindset, you'll be able to take advantage of opportunity.
So you reckon the door's always knocking?
Always. If you're prepared to look, whether that's in career or life or whatever it is, but there's always opportunity there. I think you just have to present yourself with the right attitude and keep an open mind about things.
Well, on that theme, what would you say was the best advice you received during your career?
It's quite simple, to be honest. Don't worry. Don't spend time and energy worrying about things you don't control. Focus on the things that you can control. And it goes back to that point before about opportunity. The two things you can always control are your attitude and your effort. And so the other bit of advice on that, I guess, is it's got a bit of a positive slant to it, but there's always light behind the clouds. You know, keep that positive attitude. Things, even if they're a bit tough, it'll pass. And always sort of look for that positive opportunity.
So does the pressure get to you?
Not so much. I mean, there are times where I worry about things, but I've never really been consumed by stress. I don't often lose sleep at night worrying about things. I think I just think about, again, what are those things that I can actually control? And when it really boils down and you can really streamline that, you realise that there are some things you can control. You make your best efforts at those sorts of things, and then the rest of the stuff will take care of itself.
We'll come to it fairly soon, but I'm sure I read somewhere that I think you've outlined you don't take yourself too seriously. Is that true?
Yeah, it's very true.
As a leader, that's the way it's...
Yeah, I don't think I've changed at all as a person. I think I've been given some of these roles and some of these opportunities to lead people and teams, and maybe those teams have got bigger over time, but I don't see myself any differently. So part of that, I think, is just having that perspective, and I guess my own perspective is I can't take myself too seriously because I also understand how much I rely on good people around me. It's not always about me. In fact, it's probably not about me at all, really. It's more about the teams and what we're trying to achieve. But no, I don't take myself too seriously on that.
So where was the beginnings of Anthony Boyd?
Grew up in Sydney, born and raised in Sydney. Awesome childhood, great family. One of 4 boys.
Oh, yeah.
So
pretty competitive background then.
Very competitive background. Competitive at dinner time, competitive in the backyard, playing sport. It was always about sport.
Yep.
You know, we're in an age where a lot of people were in my generation where you didn't have digital entertainment.
Yep.
Video games would never appeared in our house. It was always outside. It was activity. It was playing. And so, you know, all year round, we'd be playing sport in the backyard or in the local neighbourhood. We moved around a lot. You know, we were around and often playing at all hours of the day, you know, out in the neighbourhood. And that was awesome. And I guess that was my introduction to sport, really, as well. You know, having that exposure to different people in the neighbourhood, different kids, age groups, all that sort of stuff. It was just a great way to explore where you were, you know, where you fit in and that sort of ability to connect with different people. And obviously, when you're playing sport then as a kid, there's a lot of parallels that you draw between that and your future life and your career as well.
One of 4, did you say?
Yeah, 4 boys.
Where do you come into that in that order?
I'm number 2.
Number 2, okay.
But it's pretty tight. Mum had my older brother at, I think, 22, and she had 4 boys under whatever it was, 6 or 7 by the time she was kind of late 20s. So it's probably a different era back then, and she was awesome. You know, just seeing how difficult it is for mums, having gone through that myself with Eb and the girls now, it's amazing to think, you know, what parents are able to do in that regard.
What was Mum and Dad doing for their roles in those days?
Yeah, Dad worked for a long time with the Sydney Water Board. He was a chemical technician. He had a long career with government, and it's quite funny looking back on it now because his ambition was around his family. And I've had that conversation with him since, not really understanding it at the time. Obviously, I was completely blind to it at the time. Yeah. But having had that conversation with him, his priority was about making sure he was home to take us to football practice or, you know, be around, have dinner at home. And so it's amazing because he gave up opportunities for promotion to make sure that he wasn't compromising the idea of either having to work on weekends and these sorts of things. So we didn't have a lot of money, really. I mean, we were very comfortable, but it wasn't as if we were going to Disneyland for our annual holidays. They budgeted and they scrapped through.
Up to the Gold Coast if you're lucky.
Gold Coast, South Coast, go down to see Grandma and Grandpa at the South Coast. That was what it was. It was in the car, and I think that just reflects them prioritising things. And obviously we never went hungry, and I'm sure feeding 4 teenage boys wasn't easy for Mum to go to the grocery store and those sort of things, but they did it, and we had a ball. We're really close still. It was a great family childhood.
Did they actually put a lot of weighting on education?
They did. They wanted us to take it seriously, but they never really put pressure on us. You know, they really let us run our own race. We're all a bit different in that regard.
Yep.
We all did okay, but it was never that you sit down, this is what you have to do, and then you're going to go to university and you're going to do this. It was never really about that. It was more about, I think, to be honest, being happy, find your passion. We're all very different in terms of where we've ended up in different careers. So, no, it was just more about being good people.
Oh, you're an accountant by background. Was that your passion, was it?
No, I wouldn't say it was my passion. Yeah, look, it was something that I looked at school. I always had an interest in the world of business.
Yep.
And I actually, during my last year of school, saw that it was PricewaterhouseCoopers, or it was Price Waterhouse at the time.
Nice, yep. Big 8.
The Big 8.
Yep.
And they offered these cadetship programs. And so one of my teachers at school actually said, look, maybe this is something you might want to consider. And so I was offered an undergraduate cadetship with Price Waterhouse, and it was awesome. So I'd worked for 6 months for Price Waterhouse before I turned 18. straight out of school, I did uni over that 4-year block,
Yep.
2 years part-time, 2 years full-time. So I had work experience.
Yep.
And then coming out the other side of that, I was quite young when I became qualified. So suddenly I was a manager in Price Waterhouse at 23, 24 years old, and had this great exposure to not only lots of different businesses and different industries that you get through those sort of professional services firms, but an opportunity to lead teams and to build teams. And that was everything for me. So I think it was more about, I knew from a young age I wouldn't probably work for myself. I always loved the idea of, how does human behavior work? How are teams formed? How do people work together? That was always a big thing for me. So I knew I'd always be in sort of a larger organisation. I just, I probably stumbled my way a little bit into accounting.
Did you lead teams as a young guy playing sport?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I was captain of a few football teams and cricket teams and those sort of things. I think it was something that...
So what do you reckon they went to? Because the old days you used to get chosen as a captain because you're the best player, which was the worst thing the coach used to do, right?
Yeah.
Or were you actually chosen because you think you're actually a pretty good leader?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I haven't really thought back on it so much. Maybe there were leadership qualities that you didn't see in yourself, but you naturally maybe carried out.
Yeah.
It might have been maybe talking or leading by example. I'm not sure exactly.
Okay. Did you enjoy it?
Loved it.
Yeah.
So that was one thing.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. So looking back on it, I actually did enjoy being captain of teams.
Yep.
And I guess, in a lot of ways when you're in a school team or a junior team,
Yep.
there is that probably natural hierarchy of leadership that forms even without having someone with a captain next to their name.
Correct.
And that's true in life and sport and all those things anyway. But now you ask me, yeah, I did really enjoy it.
So PricewaterhouseCoopers, it's a pretty disciplined type of career as well. You said you inherited or started acquiring a team as you were building your career. Where did you stand out differently to the others or the predecessors?
Yeah, this is a
or is it formulaic?
It's actually not. Well, I don't know if it is now. It definitely wasn't back then. I think, and it seems silly maybe saying it this way, but I think because I was playing rugby,
yep,
and I think in a lot of ways the senior partners in the firm saw that there was a balance, there was perspective, there was maybe a life outside of work. Mm-hmm. That was an advantage. And in a lot of ways, I used to have some partners say to me, mate, if you've got to go to training, you go. Don't worry about staying here for the full day if you've got to get to training early and those sort of things.
Wow.
So I think they probably saw the benefit of perspective and balance. I always think that if people are busy and they've got this ability to sort of follow a passion, you become more efficient at everything you're doing. So there was always that sense of, I can balance all this stuff. I can still perform at a level that's expected of me. And I was still doing really well at work, but I just wasn't throwing everything I possibly had into work. And I think that might have helped.
Ultimately, you decided to move on. Where did you go to?
So I actually went up to Hong Kong to play a rugby tournament in the early 2000s, 2001. And I love the city.
Yep.
And came home after the tournament up there and was actually offered a potential position for one of the rugby clubs up there. So I'd been thinking for a long time. I did actually think to myself, I couldn't see myself staying at Price Waterhouse for the rest of my life. Yep. I did want a change to some degree. So this was an opportunity to do a big change, not just a change in employer and business that I was working for, but a change in city, a change in life.
Yeah.
So I went up to Hong Kong. It took a bit of a gamble, to be honest. It wasn't like I didn't have the job at the time. I actually went up. I had the football, but then went up and actually looked for opportunities up there. And this great opportunity came with the Swire Group, who own Cathay Pacific.
Yep.
And I worked in sort of they had a general management team that they used to be really proactive, moving around and giving opportunities to different people. And I had this awesome opportunity then to work for Cathay Pacific, where I was for nearly 4 years.
Just on that, I've worked with Swire in the past. Were you impressed by them?
Really impressed.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know a lot about them. You want to maybe give us a bit of flavour of that?
Their whole story. So this is, well over 150 years old and a really established business in the UK who had that real pioneering innovation spirit. So they ventured out. They had shipping companies. They had all of these agricultural companies. And then they moved into manufacturing, and they moved into property, and they moved into refrigeration and all of these other, retail.
Shopping centres,
Yep. And they had this, I think, this great, almost like this adventurous spirit about them.
Yeah, pioneers, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Like a lot of those really good British companies that then went out to the far-flung, fetches of the world and So Asia was a huge market for
the
them.
Far East.
The Far East, and obviously their history there is very strong. They're a very well-respected company. For me, it was this amazing opportunity because it wasn't only about then an ability to maybe think of myself developing a bit further around teams and senior leadership and some of these sort of skills. There was also the idea of, well, what are those cultural differences? How do you form high-performance teams in different cultures when you don't have the same backgrounds, diversity, all of those things? And then for a kid that had spent most of his time in Sydney, suddenly I was travelling the world, working for an airline. I had a great opportunity to spend time in a whole bunch of different markets. Suddenly I was working with teams in the US, in Europe, all throughout Asia. And that ability to I guess, see the world and see a business from a different perspective, it was awesome.
Make much money in the airline sector? It's pretty tight, isn't it?
Airlines are amazing businesses. The whole airline industry is amazing. It was a great time for me.
So what years were they?
It was 2001 to 2005.
Okay, so good years.
Great years,
Yep.
Great years, but there was a hiccup, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But airlines are amazing businesses when you've got aircraft that are full and they're in the sky. In early 2003, SARS.
Yeah.
Right? So
Smack bang, you're sitting there right in it.
right in it. And for an airline that is every flight is either going into or coming out of Hong Kong,
Yep.
and Hong Kong was the epicenter of the SARS
That's right.
epidemic, it was a big thing. And so they had by far their worst 6 months ever. They had a situation where at the time there were probably 80 aircraft in the fleet. And within, I think, the course of about 4 to 6 weeks, about 75 of those were parked.
Is that right?
Yep. So they put all the captains on the planes, flew them. A lot of them were in Australia, actually, because that was some of the cheapest places you could, aircraft cost money to leave on the ground.
Yeah.
And they found a lot of cheaper sort of parking spaces in Australia. So they flew their fleet down.
Yep.
At one stage, I think we only had one aircraft in operation. That was one daily flight to Taipei and back. So there was that part. The second part was they were still bleeding cash.
Yes.
So we had our CFO at the time with one of those calendars on the wall that literally you rip a page off and the number goes down. And they were the days of liquidity left in the business.
Is that right?
Serious? I'm serious. And it got down to around about 50. The irony of that was that previous to that, for a number of years, there were a lot of analysts and a lot of investors that would push Cathay and say, your balance sheet's lazy. You're not pushing yourself hard enough. You've got too much liquidity. Suddenly...
Which is interesting, being a company which is frontier focused, but conservative in many cases as well, aren't they?
Well, it turned out to be the smartest thing that they could have ever have done, to have this liquidity buffer that then got them through SARS, because this 6 months was horrible. So we're ripping these pages off the calendar every day. Then you think of it from a people perspective.
Yep.
So suddenly you've got crew, or cabin crew and flight crew grounded.
Yep.
You had a number of office staff that were still trying to run the business, but at one stage management came out and asked everybody to take at least 4 weeks of unpaid leave.
Yep.
Which I think 97, 98% of people straight away said, absolutely, we'll do it. But the irony of that was that I think it was around June or July, SARS just went off the front pages. It was then became not an issue at all. They got completely on top of it. And all the pent-up demand for travel suddenly fell into the second half of the year. Cathay had their best 6 months they'd ever had in that second half of 2003. And the planes filled up again. They brought them all back into service. People were flying around again. And management came out, I'll never forget this, they came out at the end of the year and they said, everyone who took that leave, we really thank you for it, but we're going to pay you for it. Because obviously you put your hand up and said you'll take it without pay, but we've done well, and that was part of the reason was we were conserving cash flow through that time, and we're going to pay you for it.
So Anthony, what were your observations, bearing in mind this is completely the unknown, major corporate, leaders under pressure, and there's a culture. Does the actual culture survive? Is it getting turfed out the window? Are behaviours not in alignment with what was being expected? Like, great opportunity to see all the rhetoric really match the actions.
Absolutely. And this was everything. This is where I learned at the time, and I've said it since, but from a business point of view, there were two things you had to focus on: people and cash flow. So it became that simple. So suddenly, in that order too, people are most important because it's about nurturing, like you said, culture. Culture can dissipate very quickly if people don't feel like they're being nurtured. And even if in times of trouble, that's probably when culture has to play its biggest role.
And we didn't have Zoom in those days either.
No Zoom. A lot of people were just went home, right? Because they were taking leave. So there was constant communication. One of the things they did, actually, I'll never forget this either. They had a number of doctors on staff for flight checks and all of those sorts of things.
Yep.
They sent a daily email to all staff from the doctor saying, here are all the facts around SARS. Here's all the statistical information. Here's what you shouldn't believe that's in the papers. Here's all the real medical facts. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to do at the time, because that's culture by another name. We're going to really nurture information flow and communications and be really clear and provide that clarity to all staff. And that really paid off.
How'd you go? When you stand back and look at yourself, you're observing everybody else, but now looking back, how'd you handle it all?
I think that was one of those times where I did learn to just worry about things I could control. A couple of times I'd have people ringing from Australia because it was headline news, right, around the world, and people were going, what are you doing still there?
Yeah, get out.
Come home. And at the time, it probably wasn't that level of risk up there. People didn't feel that way, if I'm being honest. It was more, we kind of knew where the risks were and you knew what to do and those sorts of things. But I think if you let it get away from you and you start to worry about these big things that you have no control over, you do start to worry about things. And that was a big lesson for me at that stage. I was still quite young, but it was a really good perspective to take.
The level of business discussion in Hong Kong, it's mouthwatering, it's eye-opening, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's quick. You've got a German, you've got a French, you've got an Italian, someone from North America, someone from the UK sitting at the table.
Absolutely. And that just brings with it this sort of, I guess, natural expectation of high performance. It's a very business-focused city. People are always thinking about who's here, what are things do, what are the trends. It's obviously one of the biggest money markets in the world,
yep.
And a huge commercial market. So I was fascinated by that, being able to have colleagues, friends, business associates that had such diverse backgrounds, like you say, ethnicity and age and experience. So for me at that time, it was I learned so much in those years.
So what is high performance, Anthony?
Yeah, look, it's ambition. There's no doubt about that. It's about setting a bar that probably not yet achieved.
Which could be just saving the airline as well, couldn't it, during that time?
Correct. So high performance is just about, and then it's alignment. So once you have a team that's aligned with not just how they're going to operate together, but what they want to achieve together, and then about setting guidelines as to how to do that.
Is it as simple as that? Because if it's that simple, Anthony, why aren't we seeing high performance left, right and centre?
Good question. I do think it's that simple, really. If you can get that clarity and then get the right people to execute on that clarity, that's really what it is. But I guess if you look at it from your side, that question is a good question because, you see everything from the obvious team environments, which I say sporting teams that you can see every week, and you see cultures play out in different ways. But you also see businesses struggle through things that are culture related. And I do put culture and high performance in that very clear bucket. I think you can have a business that's got a great strategy, but that doesn't guarantee that you're high performance if you don't have that culture to match it. So, I've always thought of this triangle almost between your strategy, your culture, and your brand. And your brand's everything, obviously, that faces externally. Yeah. You can't do anything in that triangle without it affecting the other two sides. And high-performance teams sit right in the middle of that triangle.
And managing that brand, that's imperative to you?
It's super imperative. I think in a lot of ways, it should be driving a lot of that stuff that happens in either strategy or culture. And yeah, it's interesting to see how my time at Fraser's, that's actually evolved a lot and is really changing, I guess, our belief and our focus as a business around what's important.
All right. Well, what is Fraser's and how did you end up there after this successful time in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I pretty much stumbled into Fraser's, if I'm being honest.
You stumbled into Hong Kong, so you're doing pretty well.
I've stumbled everywhere, to be honest. I've actually never sat down and put a career plan out. Right?
Is that serious?
Yep, I've never.
So you are high performance, but no career plan?
Yeah, I just haven't seen myself as a project for high performance.
Did you set out to achieve anything?
I think I just wanted to make sure that I had an ambition in terms of like achieving things, but it wasn't necessarily trying to draw those in a box and say, by that age, I wanted that exposure or that title or that role. Those things have actually never worried me. They don't actually even worry me now.
Yep.
It's more about saying, what can I have an influence over?
Yep.
What can I potentially help control?
Yep.
And then what's that ambition that we can set collectively, and then working with great people and putting those teams around you to achieve those things.
How does that sit with Dad?
It's probably come from him, if I'm being honest, because again, he's not, but at least that ambition was still very grounded in his personality.
Yep.
I don't think he's never pretended to be anything other than who he is. And I think that's the similarity that allows this. I think it's that authenticity that allows you to be high performance, because again, it goes back to that first question you asked me, but it's if you're doing something you're passionate about. And sometimes that's a technical outcome. Sometimes that might be property for some people. It might be aircraft for other people. It might be cars. It might be those physical things. But for me, I think it's about people. It's about human behavior and about giving people opportunities to grow themselves and to be leaders themselves. And I'd like to think that's probably my dad's best legacy, and that one day hopefully might be my best legacy.
And did Mum give you the sense of adventure?
Yeah, they were just really down to earth, great people. So they always encouraged us to kind of push the boundaries.
Yep.
They didn't have expectations of it, but they never held us back on anything. And we're always so supportive. And that's something that I've been really lucky with, really blessed with, I guess, is just this idea that people have been supportive of that. And that came from family, and then it's evolved into my career as well.
Okay, well, why didn't you keep going north? Why didn't you go up to England or to the US? Why did you've seen the big wide world.
Probably
Next part is to live somewhere else. Why did you come back home?
Yeah, probably those things I've been talking about. I miss my family.
Yeah, right.
Just that proximity, right? That connection, that sense of belonging, that idea that you're part of something. And they all came up to visit, and we'd come home to visit, but it was that sense that for Eb and I, we'd been there for 4 years. We were thinking about starting a family, and we just wanted to make sure that we could do that around our extended family.
Okay, so you make the big call and you come back to Australia.
Yep.
You didn't want to stay in the airline industry? Or did you?
Oh, look, I could have.
Yep.
I could have. It was a fascinating industry. And in fact, the Swire Group were great, but they actually said to me at the time, look, you are probably on a trajectory that might be bigger than what we've got for you in Australia right now. Yes. We had a very open conversation about it. Which was great. Yep. And then I had an opportunity to interview for a few different companies, and it was Australand at the time.
Yes.
And they gave me a great role, which was really a corporate finance role to start with. But then, soon after, as you know, Australand were listed in that time, but it's evolved very much since then.
So come on, talk us through. What is this company?
Yeah, so Fraser's Property Limited, listed in Singapore, is a multinational property development and ownership business. 70 plus cities, $40 billion plus in assets. It's a huge company, multi-asset class, so across commercial, retail, industrial, hospitality, residential, with a really strong focus on end-to-end capability that allows you to effectively develop your own investment portfolio, is predominantly what the strength of the business is. Fraser's Property Australia, that I'm part of, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Singapore entity. Still a very big business. We focus more on the development of complex, sort of master planned mixed-use developments in the major capital cities of Australia, and also developing assets that we manage long-term that become investment assets, predominantly across commercial and retail, but increasingly now residential as well.
So you're amongst it right now then, aren't you?
Yeah, it's an amazing time,
yeah.
To be honest. And we've got some great projects as well. But yeah, what's been really great for me is this ability to kind of push, I guess, outside the realms of just real estate and think much more about our place in sort of society and our place, for our customers.
All right, I'm going to come to that in a second. How did you get the role as chief exec? And how do you make yourself, in your mind, be selected to be chief exec?
The company has a very strong succession planning framework, and where possible, they promote from within. So that's the first part. The second part was, for me personally, I've had nearly 17 years there. So say 15 before I became CEO, and had plenty of opportunities in that role, 7 sort of different roles. I spent some of that time in Melbourne, running a business down in Melbourne, and moving around different parts of the business.
So you've been blooded out of finance?
Yes, out of finance reasonably quickly. And that was
a smart move.
Well, that was something that was a joint decision between the CEO at the time, Bob Johnston, and Rod, who was the executive general manager of the residential division at the time. And we had a very open conversation about it. And I actually said that I didn't see myself as a long-term finance professional.
Yep.
I probably didn't want to be a CFO. So what would that mean? And sometimes that's a bit of a difficult conversation, to be fair, because they might say, "Well, actually, that's all you've got,"
Yeah.
and that was
Well, that's all we've got.
That's what we've got, and I was prepared for that too.
Yep.
But when I guess they showed a belief in me, gave me the opportunities, and so for me, it was just then about really understanding the business from different perspectives.
Yep.
And so almost accumulating this knowledge and through both relationships and just the technical expertise across the business, being able to see the business from different areas, learn the business. And I think I might have said it before, but because I don't think I've changed much. So
Yep.
I think people have probably said, well, you can maybe have a go at this job. And all I've done is just bring my own skills to that job.
Just stumble forward again.
Stumble again.
Yeah.
But again, just throw yourself into it.
What do you love about business?
It's that ability to be something for a customer, have your place in the
That's
world.
not a cliche, is it?
No, not at all.
Okay,
not at
go
all.
on.
Have your place in the world, right? Why is the world better for you existing? It's a pretty existential question.
Yeah, it is.
But if you can ask yourself that, and as a business you can understand that, and then you start to translate your culture to reflect that, that's an awesome opportunity because people put their trust in you.
Correct.
People invest themselves into a business because of what either that business stands for or what their leaders represent and what their leaders can potentially do for them. So that's an awesome opportunity, but a pretty big responsibility at the same time.
Yeah, but you also had the other challenge, which was, would you say 17 years in the organisation
Yep.
before you became CEO? That means you're pretty well known.
Yes.
And everyone's got a view on you, right? And
Yes.
they've probably pigeonholed you in some form or another.
Yep.
And then suddenly, guess what? There's a new announcement. We've made the call. The gentleman down there in the hallway is now going to be the chief exec. How do you go about bringing everybody online?
Again, I think the first thing is don't change for me. It was saying, okay, I'm going to do this job, but I'm not going to be anyone different. It goes back to the football days. If the selection team pick you in the side, it's not your choice, right? So all you can do is get on the field and play the best you can possibly play.
Yep.
And worry about the things that you're doing and what you bring to the team. In a lot of ways, it's the same. So a board is saying, we want that person to be the CEO. You don't pick yourself. So in a lot of ways, if people don't like that decision, that's okay.
They self-select anyway, right?
In a lot of ways, they will.
Yep.
Or they might come around, or a combination of the two.
Yep.
But really, you can't then worry about that. What you have to be able to do is generate that next layer of ambition, and obviously generate that next layer of culture that allows people to get behind you and I guess believe in that next vision for the business.
Did you want the job?
Yeah, I did.
Were you ready for the job?
No, don't think anyone's ever ready. But at the same
Are you
time,
serious? You really weren't ready?
well, I don't know if you're ever ready for the job in terms of walking in and saying, I'm completely comfortable with everything I've got to do tomorrow.
That's true.
Yeah, and I'm not. It doesn't worry me sort of admitting that. I don't think anyone would have ever taken a job like the CEO. People might say, "Oh, okay, well, are you ready for the CEO role?" I think you're probably more ready in other people's eyes than you are in your own, because you probably bring a skill set that they want and they have trust in to be able to deliver on what, and then let you find your feet. I think from an internal point of view, you've got to find your feet. So if you haven't found your feet before you start, well, then you're probably not, you don't think you're ready.
Yeah.
But in reality, there's only certain things you can do. You start, right? Someone gives you a box of business cards and you sit at your desk, and then it's the first day and you start. You start talking and you start thinking about things. And the beauty for me was when I say I wasn't ready, that doesn't.
You're getting groomed, weren't you?
Yes, and that doesn't mean, well, in some degree. So when I moved into the CFO role,
Yep.
That was part of the succession planning, and that was great. And even during that time, I had some really detailed conversations with Rod at the time, who was the CEO and became chairman,
Yep.
about what my vision would be if I was ever given the role of CEO.
Okay, so he's testing the waters, is he?
A little bit. And I was probably testing them with him too.
Yep.
In a way where I had some ideas, and it's difficult talking to a current CEO about things that I might do differently.
Yeah.
But Rod is just one of those guys that was so nurturing in that, had already given me a number of opportunities and was so nurturing that we just had really organic conversations about it. So when I say I wasn't ready, I guess I just hadn't seen myself in that role and title, but I had thought a lot about what the business could do, and potentially how we could be better as a business.
Anthony, so when you when you get appointed as chief exec, do you go home that night and say, no, great news, we cracked the champagne, et cetera, but do you then sit quietly and say, when I do leave one day, this is what I want to be remembered for? Do you have that introspective bit of thinking early on? Because that's going to set a course, I assume. Or as you said earlier, I've just walked in, got the business cards, I sit down and I take it. You're not taking it day by day, of course. You don't operate in that manner. But where is the thinking?
Yeah, it's probably a combination of those two things, because you are excited about the opportunity that's ahead of you.
Yeah.
But you do also have that idea that, well, it's not going to be forever.
Yep.
So immediately you're starting to think, well, what are those things? Not necessarily in a selfish way around personal legacy, but about just being a custodian of the business. It's a great business. I mean, we've been around nearly 100 years. And so obviously I don't know every CEO of the business, but I know the last 3 or 4. And I look at their legacy as a custodian of this business for a period of time, and they put their own fingerprints on it. And as certain as anything, there'll be a day where someone else is announced as the CEO of the business. And to me, that's this great organic place to be, where you can actually start to think about what are those things. Like, I better get started, because if we are going to achieve some of these things that I want to achieve, we've got to get on with it straight away.
So, Anthony, what did you set out to achieve?
So there was a bit with the customer. So I said before, we obviously had this really big focus on customer, and this idea that we wanted to...
And who is the customer? Talk us through who is the customer.
We've got varied customers. So we might have a customer who buys an apartment or a house office that lives in one of our communities. Our customers are also tenants in a retail environment or a commercial environment. Mm-hmm. They could be customers of our shopping centres. So customers are varied in our business.
Yep.
But the way we approached it was, well, how do you think about this organically and become a business that's much more outwardly focused than probably being selfish around the design and delivery of places as we think they should be? Mm-hmm. And so I said before about this ambition of, and this is probably a long answer, by the way, because we have been obsessed about this for the last couple of years, but when we took this view of, well, why is the world better for us existing? What do we do and what do we represent? We've spent a lot of time with Simon Hammond. He's a guy, he runs a business called 50 Crates, and he's really a human behavior and social trends expert. Right, he just happens to work with businesses.
Right.
So that's been really insightful. Part of that is just about saying, then, who are we, right? So we're multiple things to people. We're ambition, we're security, we're safety, we're convenience. It's not just real estate, it's lifestyle. So then you need to have almost this fundamental sort of emotional understanding of society, mm-hmm. including some of those things that, social trends and how will that impact us as a business. So as you know, Greg, we were talking about it earlier today, but there's a few things. One, property is getting more diverse, right? So it's becoming, I guess, more blurred and adaptable because work life's getting more blurred.
Yep.
So naturally neighborhoods are becoming more diverse. Family structures are changing. They're very different to what they were 2 or 3 generations ago.
Yes.
You've got household formation changing as a result of that. There's more single-person households now than ever before, and that's an increasing trend. You've got this reliance on, and this is a societal thing, we've got this reliance on, or almost an obsession with technology.
Obsession?
I think it's an obsession. I mean, all you got to do is walk down a train station nowadays and see people looking at their phones, right? Yep. So all of this stuff, and then you've got social media, which in a lot of ways sits on top of this technology box and people get sucked into. Then above everything, people are busy. They're almost busy being busy. Everyone I speak to is busy. So then you sort of have to think about that from a second and think, well, despite the fact that technology and social media in particular are supposed to be about building connection, the reality is loneliness is almost an epidemic. Like, loneliness is a big issue. So the way we look at it, the horse is bolted on technology. We're not putting that genie back in the bottle, right? And that's fine. But humans are actually hardwired to find belonging and find genuine connection and trust.
Yep.
There's biological and chemical responses that have been proven over multiple studies, over multiple decades, across all cultures and all different age groups, that there are both emotional and physical benefits for people when they feel belonging and feel like they're connected. And the question then becomes for us, how can neighbourhoods and places that we create enhance people's mental or physical well-being through connection?
Well, you said the word communities earlier. Is that what you're alluding to?
Yeah.
What is that actually? What is a community in your eyes?
Well, I guess what we have to think about is, and this is what we're trying to understand better, is how do you translate that sort of knowledge into outcomes in our projects that allow people to I guess, fundamentally feel more connected? Like we actually believe that society's future, in terms of having a successful and sort of happy future, is based on those fundamental promises of sort of human connection.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but has that changed then?
Well, I
through
think
history.
We
all like to be connected, don't we? We all like to be patted on the back and share stuff or listened to.
Absolutely.
That nothing's changed in that regard.
Absolutely. I like to think of it as if the history of human beings is a 24-hour day-long period, we've probably had this much technology in our lives for the last 2 minutes.
Yeah.
What we're trying to unpack is what's this difference between this fundamental sort of human nature type thing that's driving connection and belonging, and how is technology and social media potentially trying to substitute for that, but actually not doing a really good job of it? So this idea of neighborhood and community, and look, COVID's been something that's probably shone a light on this a little bit more, but these trends were happening well before COVID.
Okay.
But suddenly it becomes very local. How do people value and prioritize those local connections? For us, we then have come up with this idea that belonging almost becomes the key to feeling proud about how you live your life. And that changed our belief. Our belief now is that we exist to create belonging because we believe our future depends on how we live life together. That's very unusual for a property company in a lot of ways. And to us, we've realized very quickly that whilst the neighborhood and the streetscapes is that sort of hardscape that we produce in a tangible context, communities, strong communities, are actually the intangible measure of that success of that neighborhood. And so this is amazing. So all we're trying to do then is to explore, well, what can we do? What are the better ways that we can create not just the places, but also the opportunities for people to make those genuine connections in our projects?
Okay, so if I'm listening out there, Anthony, can you draw some pictures in my mind? What are you talking about if I walk into one of your properties or I walk into a shopping centre? Give me some examples.
So what it will be is this idea that how are you designing and delivering places that feel... I think a lot of people will naturally affiliate with the idea that some places feel better than others.
Yep.
So that there's almost like this intangible feeling piece. A lot of that's about design. A lot of that's about thinking about, people might call it human-centric design and those sorts of things. Really, that's just about saying, how can we create places where people feel as though they can make those connections when they want to, but also provide the security and maybe the solidarity and privacy when they need them as well. So some of that's about adaptability of space. The next layer, though, is about assisting with that development of that community. So as a brand now, we are spending as much time and attention on who's that community? Because the other thing is you've got to be really careful with this. It's very nuanced. It's not a cookie cutter approach. You can't just roll out the same thing every time. You have to think about who's going to be living in these spaces, who's shopping, who's working in these communities, and how are you helping to bring them together? So are they events? Are they incubators for small business operators that live in the same community? Are they exercise classes? What are they these things that, and it's not necessarily new, but it's just really putting a focus on those things because we know the value for our brand is actually what our projects look like 20 years after we've walked away from them rather than the day we sell our last property.
What sort of results are you getting?
It's been really fascinating because this is something we've probably spent time changing our focus on over sort of 5 to 6 years.
Yep.
So it's not as if as CEO that I introduced some of these concepts, but I definitely introduced the idea of, say, NPS, so measuring customer promoter scores. So again, you look at society in terms of one of its biggest changes, people are much more likely to take a recommendation from a friend or someone else, even someone who they don't even know, compared to reading an ad in a magazine that the business is talking about themselves. So we know the value of advocacy. We know the value of people that support our brand. So the way you measure it, something like NPS has grown significantly over time.
Mm-hmm.
You also have a measure for us, because we're not selling a high volume manufactured good, a lot of what we track is, say, repeat or referred business.
Yes.
And that's something that, again, just for a property company is really everything, because that becomes brand advocacy.
Yep.
And that's trended up significantly over time as well, from probably somewhere down below 10% to now nudging nearly 40% in some of our projects, which is monumental in terms of that change.
The people you're surrounding yourself with now, has that changed much in the last 5 years, bearing in mind the journey that you're undertaking or the thinking that you're presenting?
It actually hasn't changed at all. In fact,
That's an interesting comment, isn't it?
Yeah, we still spend time as a business really talking to customers, and part of this, I guess, desire to explore and really understand belonging better and really understand what it means for people to live life together is talking to customers, talking to normal people that are out there just living and working and shopping in our environments. But the people I surround myself with really hasn't changed. I mean, I still spend a lot of time with my best mates, which are my footy mates from 20, 25 years ago, my family, and those sort of things. But I think that's almost the essence of what we're trying to crack here, is to not try to be overly cerebral or try to over manufacture these outcomes through the lens of, sophisticated property fundamentals. This is just about saying, what do these places feel like and how are these communities going to thrive? And other than people, people like Simon are great. And it's not as if I'm not exposing myself to other thinking as well. So that is something that we definitely are doing. But I think the fundamentals of who we're surrounding ourselves with is pretty consistent.
So how do you operate as a leader?
Very openly, very transparently. We've got a really close team, as you mentioned before. A lot of my team now, who on an org chart report to me, but I consider peers really.
Do you really?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
I do.
okay.
I don't think. I think there's a natural hierarchy when there has to be.
Someone in the room's got to make a decision.
When someone has to make a decision or someone has to present something or whatever, and that's okay.
Yeah. But then again, it shouldn't be too many surprises, I assume, either.
That's right. And when most of the operations and most of the ambition that's happening is actually sitting underneath you in the business somewhere, I don't really see myself above anyone in the business in that regard. So from a leadership point of view, we've got a very, very close team. We're always checking in with each other around that bigger picture alignment stuff.
Yep.
But also just the day-to-day operational stuff is very organic, because I think there's not, and this is something I think we're very lucky with, is in a culture, there's not a lot of ego. And to be honest, this is a historical thing. I definitely inherited it, and it's been something that's been part of our culture for a long time. Not a lot of ego, not a huge reliance on hierarchy or bureaucracy to make decisions. We value opinion from people, and access to leaders in our business is actually very, very organic.
When you say organic, what do you mean by that?
We've got no offices. Leaders aren't hidden behind doors.
Okay.
We're all sitting out in the same environment as everyone does in the business.
Yep.
We've got this sense that if anyone wants to speak to a leader at any time, there's no gates to get through to actually get access to those people. And you see leaders all the time in our business just literally walking the floor and having conversations with people and being out on projects and having this sort of authentic, organic discussion.
All right. Wind that memory back from as a young person at PwC and at the Swire Group. And Swire Group's very traditional, but very good leaders. Where do you at then? Do you think open plan, that no gates, the discussion you suggested just there?
Yep.
Does that bring a different result?
That's definitely changed, because especially in that professional services firm, there were the partners that had the big offices.
Oh, that's right. That was where you had to get to.
Correct. But I also...
But does it get different outcomes or different performance levels based on what you've seen or not?
I still think the best outcomes that were achieved in any of those organisations I've worked for came down to individual leadership styles, and they were always the same as I've just explained. That they just didn't, I think, put themselves above, even though their titles and the hierarchy might have naturally put themselves above it, there were individuals that cracked that code and didn't see themselves above that. And I think they were the most successful, at least in my experience, and at least in terms of nurturing people. You could see in a big organisation like PricewaterhouseCoopers, you could see, for instance, the partners and the senior managers that people were attracted to working with, because that was personal leadership at its best. And that was that authentic, organic approach to how do I treat people? How am I in terms of dealing with all types of different people? And how open am I about having sort of conversations with people? Because the other thing you got to think of too, it's not always just about shared ambition. Most of the time it is, and that's high performance teams and culture. But it also comes about, can you help me solve a problem? And if you're too distant from people, then they won't come to you with problems. And I think that's one difference that I've seen in my career too, is if leadership feels too distant for people, they'll live with those problems. And that's just slow erosion of either culture or confidence of those people. If they feel empowered enough to just walk up and say, I'm going to ask you, there's something I really need you to help me with. It's X. It could be a process. It could be a structural inefficiency. It could be something to do with a design outcome on a project.
Yep.
But I need to have this conversation with you. And if I can have that conversation and I know you're going to be listening to me and can help me, then it's going to make my life a lot easier.
What's been the biggest learning so far as a CEO?
I think that the people, or it's not necessarily a new learning. In the internal space, it's that people are just as important as ever. So it's
all about the people?
That's not new. It is.
Is it really?
It is. And then if you look at it from an outside point of view, the biggest learning for me has just been how willing our customers and those connections outside the business are willing to talk about these sort of things, about how society's changing and how we might be able to play a role in addressing some of those challenges.
So we're going to get some financial results off the back of all this?
That's the beauty, is that we see this through the lens of a financial landscape, right? This is the other thing. So we're not leading with that, right? But my firm belief, and we're seeing this in some of our results, is you lead with the right customer ambition,
yes,
and the financial results will follow. And that's something that we're definitely seeing. And you've got to be really, it's still property, right? It's still, you can still make mistakes, right? You can still make property mistakes. You can still pay too much for a block of land. You can still, have the wrong mix of whether it's residential or the wrong mix of commercial. You can still make those mistakes. So you still need really great real estate property people in your business. But if everything you're doing has this really customer-centric focus, then generally these returns that are trailing with financial returns are really positive as well.
Does the customer actually know what they want? Or do you guide them? Or do you set the vision?
A lot of the
customer centricity and all this stuff is
Yep.
used a lot. Is your job to take them, to ask them? Do they actually really know? Like, are they going to unjumble some of this sometimes?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because in fact, it can actually work both ways.
Okay.
I think the important thing is to understand you're part of a dialogue. That's the important thing. So if you go out there and just say, we know what's best, we'll tell you exactly the types of apartments you want, we'll tell you exactly the mix of mixed use here, we'll tell you exactly how much commercial you need it, then you can be fraught with danger. Equally, you can't go out there and design something by committee. You can't ask 300 future residents of a community, let's design this together, because that's not going to work either. So it's a loop. What I think is that you get this perfect, sweet spot in the middle of that, which says, as long as you are actively, and you've got to have empathy. The funny thing about all this is, and again, this is part of this realization we've come up with, people don't trust property developers.
Fancy that.
So you get this situation where we're walking in and we're saying to someone, we're about to knock these buildings over and we're going to reproduce this community. People start to worry about traffic,
absolutely,
overcrowding, population sitting in their backyards, all this sort of stuff. So when you start from that point of view, you have to say, well, how do we as a property developer win that trust?
Oh, you guys start miles from behind, don't you?
Absolutely. Well, that's the default until such time as you start to talk about the development in the context of the community and about the connections that you're genuinely trying to achieve. And it takes time, and you have to have a track record. You can't just say it, you've got to believe it. But that goes back to that authenticity. If you actually have an ability to listen, and you have empathy around what those concerns genuinely are, then you build that into your design and you build that into your outcomes. Because as I said before, it's a nuanced approach. You can't take a cookie cutter approach in a suburban development in the southeast of Melbourne and apply that to an inner city apartment building in Brisbane. You've got to be really nuanced in your approach, and you've got to be really respectful of the existing community around it and the future community. But I think the secret is just having that empathy and being able to listen.
So if you were going to give some examples, which ones would you highlight, which has really been, in your case, real test cases proving exactly where you're going?
We've got a number of what I guess you'd call exemplar projects that show the value of community focus groups, is what we'd call them.
Okay.
So actually speaking to people at the beginning of and throughout a development.
Yep.
And they range. So they range from a large, internationally recognisable development like Central Park in Chippendale in Sydney, where you've got buildings that have been awarded these amazing international, often and domestic awards for best buildings, sustainability outcomes, community outcomes, innovation outcomes. But equally, we've got developments like Fairwater out at Blacktown in Sydney, or Berwick Waters in Victoria, or Brookhaven up in Brisbane, where you're creating almost like an urban fringe type development where you are creating a community. You go to an urban growth boundary and start to develop a new environment, you're still talking to future residents. You're still talking to what are those things, what are those design elements, what are those real estate fundamentals that are actually going to help them live their life. So is it about streetscapes? Is it about building lobbies? Is it about sitting spaces? Is it about parks? A lot of people, dogs, for instance, walking dogs is one of these things that a lot of people might take for granted, but so many people at the same time of a morning or an afternoon will walk their dog. How do you make that a community outcome, right? How do you create a space and an interaction for people that they go, oh, wow, I'm going to run into that same person. People know each other's dogs' names, those sort of things. It's different for every development, but we've got lots of examples where it really makes a difference.
Do we need a minister for loneliness in Australia?
The UK thought they did. They appointed a minister for loneliness.
It's a true story then.
Yeah, in their parliament. They have seen this as one of these social outcomes that, I guess if you look at it from a different lens as well, and there's probably a whole question on housing affordability here as well, and
which we can lead into,
which we can get to.
Yep.
But if you look
in theory, it all sounds good.
Yep.
I've got to pay for it.
But can you deliver it? Exactly. So when you look at loneliness, you look at housing affordability and some of these larger issues, when you think about, okay, well, why would you appoint a minister for loneliness? Well, if you're starting to think about the downstream impacts of loneliness, and without necessarily trying to take a holistic view on what we might do as a community to help these people, then suddenly you're looking at social services, you're looking at health, all of these other, if you're the government, budgetary issues that are going to come downstream.
Yep.
So what I think that's quite proactive is thinking, well, how do we put some upstream fixes in place? How do we put the right people in the right places talking about the right things to make a difference? And you're not going to get it right. This is hard. You're not going to get it right all the time for every single person. But I think addressing it, having the conversations and at least putting those platforms in place where people can raise concerns and start to think about what are the best things to do, it's quite innovative.
Now, you and I both grew up in Sydney. Pretty tough for young people to grow up now to get their first apartment.
It is.
Anywhere near a CBD and hold down a job and work the hours, which is expected.
It is.
What's the answer here?
Yeah. I wish I knew. I don't think it's one silver bullet, to be honest. And it is interesting to kind of take a long-term view on this too. It has actually always been hard to get into the housing market. We've seen some articles that have been dug out of the Daily Mirror back in 1940 saying, can you believe it now? How are kids ever going to afford a house?
Yep.
But it is trending in a worse way. So when you look at it in terms of income ratio or any of those things, it's getting harder. So there are a number of things that we have to look at. The thing with Australian housing as well is it's a sort of an interesting asset class because it's not just about housing a population. It's an investment asset for a lot of people.
Yep.
So suddenly,
life savings.
Exactly. So suddenly it is also an asset that has the same market forces, whether it's interest rates or market sentiment or cost of whatever it might be. And that drives valuations too. So for a long time, you've seen the decrease in interest rates over time naturally translate into an increase in house prices. But at the same time, you've still got this demand issue that in effect is out of kilter with supply.
Yep.
And any market commodity, you always have to look at both sides of the equation. I think in a lot of ways, we probably get it wrong by looking at the demand side drivers. So sometimes we might make it harder for an investor because it makes a loan harder to get or change the tone around some of that language. But equally too, we've got to have a much broader conversation about supply and how do we, if you look at some of the fundamental drivers of housing in Australia, and I'm talking about the future outlook.
Yep.
If you take a view, the ABS is, I think, forecasting a reasonably conservative view on population growth.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely something that we've seen in the past. They call it 1 to 1.5%. That's going to mean we've got an extra, so from 26 million today, we'll have 36 million people in 30 years.
Yep.
So that's another 10 million people that are going to be in Australia at that time. So if you average that out and look at that in terms of, infrastructure spend and amenity and then housing, we've got to be building somewhere between 200 and 250,000 houses per annum.
Houses or apartments?
Both dwellings,
okay,
right?
So you're going to use the word dwellings now because that's all changing.
Dwellings, exactly. So the composition has to change, but we have to think.
Does it, or do we make other cities more attractive?
That's a great question. So the question around population growth, I think we need to be strategic about. But I think if we agree that population growth is important as an economic driver,
sure,
then we have to think about where that population growth is best suited.
Yep.
So is it about the existing CBDs and the existing cities, or is there too much stress around those? You talk about infrastructure costs, you talk about food and water and all of these things that sit in behind that. What we have to really be smart about is, well, why and how can we incentivize people to potentially move away from CBDs, even for a period of time? Is there something out there that might be around attracting businesses to other locations outside of cities?
Yeah.
Is that tax advantages? Is it other incentives? That naturally then means employment. The issue with CBDs and the cities as they are is that's where the employment is.
Correct.
So people are going to naturally gravitate to those CBDs, and that makes housing more expensive.
Yep.
But so part of it's this supply thing and saying, well, how do we get a diversity of housing? The thing with housing affordability and the overall market is you need a diversity, because every day of the week you've got new home buyers looking for a house, you've got upgraders who are either at different family cycles, you've got downsizers who are looking to get out of a bigger place and into a smaller place, and you've got investors. So all the time you're looking at these multiple assets across multiple drivers, and we have to address, well, in a planning context, how do we provide housing for the population in addition to the different priorities that people have in their lives?
And what's your thoughts on the actual general planning capability and actual follow through? Because we change governments so regularly.
Yeah.
You look at the fabric when we grew up. Again, we had houses. We're sitting here in the back of Surrey Hills now, where you've got the old factories being moved out the front door. You've got apartments being built, almost similar to like Hong Kong. That's very, very different. They're definitely changing.
Yeah.
But is it changing for the better? Is it changing for the worse? You get on a bus, you've got to be standing for 20 minutes all the way into the city. That's not necessarily that great either.
Yep.
But you're thinking, where was the planning done? I look at business. Sydney and Melbourne still is the major capitals for business in Australia. Perth, WA for the mining, etc. Brisbane still needs more. Adelaide still needs more. We have very little in Tasmania. Where does this all reside?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because
It's not getting any better in that regard, I don't think.
No, I don't think it is either. This is where I think you have this inefficiency where you've got multiple levels of government worrying about their own little patch.
And they're incentivized to do so as well.
Absolutely. And to be honest, they've only got the remit to do it. So I'm not saying it as an absolute negative, because they've only got certain amount of levers they can pull as well. But if what you've described is an ambition for the country, maybe there's this ambition we need to have as a federal government potentially to own housing, to own planning, to own supply as a long-term vision for the country. The issue, I think, with election cycles
3 years.
And it's layered, right? It's layered from federal through state through local government.
Yes.
So all of a sudden, you've got either incentive or disincentive to be turning supply on and off. You've got very short-term decision-making in what really, for a country that's got, I mean, a lot of countries around the world would kill to have those future growth ambitions.
Yes.
That are almost not a given for us, but are a real opportunity for us.
Are we plundering in, making some big mistakes, do you think, or
in
not?
some ways we could be. I mean, we might get it right. We might stumble our way and get it right. We've got it right so far, broadly, but as you can see, it's straining a bit.
Yep.
So I'd love to think that there's a higher order discussion around, okay, let's take a really strong 20 to 30 to 40 year view around population. Where is it going to go? How are we investing in infrastructure now and over those next 30 to 40 years to develop those opportunities? And how are you comfortably absorbing that population growth to make it a great lifestyle opportunity for people? Because that's the thing that you don't want to lose here in Australia. It's the greatest place to live by far.
Yep.
But those things that are starting to put a strain on, whether it's commuting or population that are sort of just starting to burst at the seams in certain suburbs or whatever it might be, we've got to be better than that.
Okay, I think let me flip that then. Based on your experience, if we don't have those conversations or seriously start getting some decisions about this, where do you see us in the next 30 or 40 years? Is it going to be high rises everywhere?
It could be. It could be, depending on the city. So if you look at something like Sydney, it's a very different urban fabric than what, say, Melbourne or Brisbane is.
Yep.
I mean, Melbourne can keep growing. North Melbourne will hit the bottom of Sydney before Sydney expands over the national park, right?
And it's argued Melbourne's going to have a greater population than Sydney in less than the next decade.
Correct, because it can absorb it. It's very clear, actually, and they can do it. Now, again, there's an issue with being 40 k's out from the CBD too, if there's not jobs and there's not amenity and there's not infrastructure that supports that. So I think Melbourne still has its challenges in terms of how it absorbs that population. Yeah. But if you think of Sydney, you're hemmed in. You've got mountains, ocean, water, and national park. Yep. So in a lot of ways, that pressure becomes a bit like Hong Kong. Yes. Both of us have worked up there. Both of us know that you can't just continue to urban sprawl in Hong Kong. Everything starts to become vertical. And you can do that well if you really think about it, but you still have to be thinking in broader macro planning terms. So how does suburbs transform, not just how does a block of land transform? Because that's the issue around that shorter term vision is you say, well, that one's been planning approved, go and do that development. But there is a lot of value. And look, planning instruments are doing this to some degree, but I think there's a higher order conversation that needs to be had in conjunction with that debate around population and infrastructure spend and how potentially there's an entity that might own that sits outside of that political short-termism.
You travel the world. What communities and projects have you seen in different parts of the world which impress you?
There's lots. A lot of the US developments are great. We spent a lot of time over there just doing some different tours and product tours, etc.
Yep.
A lot of the European countries are great with planning and developing communities that are adaptable, that are mixed use, but that really are focused on not just the population today, but about really the sustainability. I think this is...
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, this is the next nuance, right? So sustainability has obviously been a buzzword for some time, but I think there's more and more pressure now on what constitutes good development and what constitutes good planning through the lens of sustainability. And it's much broader now. I think maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when you spoke about sustainability, you spoke about green initiatives, environmental initiatives, which is still very important. So, water and waste and energy, all those things are still very important. And there's been a huge amount of advancements in that space. We're doing a lot of stuff internally. We own our own utilities business now. We actually produce or provide energy for our residents and our customers.
Trade it back on the grid?
Yeah. So we have obviously embedded networks and these sorts of things. So there's been a huge advancement in that space. But where sustainability as a broader concept has moved to is now much more around, like we were saying before, personal health and well-being, community health and well-being, resilience, all of these different things that are now part of people's ideas and expectations. There was a time where you could offer sustainability to a customer and they'd say, it sounds good, but I'm not prepared to pay for it. All of a sudden, it's going to be an expectation for people that, well, I'm assuming now that you're building 5-star, Green Star, or you're building things that are energy efficient or water efficient, etc. The next layer, which comes down to your space, Greg, is so the property industry and the built industry is actually one of the largest emitters, the biggest carbon emitters.
Yes.
How do we as an industry, and then us as a business, for instance, keep attracting people to come and work for us if we aren't really focused on tangible outcomes and actually making meaningful progress in the space of sustainability? I think there's a gap here now that if you're not doing it, not only are your customers going to disappear,
absolutely,
but you'll actually have trouble getting a workforce.
Absolutely. We're already seeing that, aren't we? Particularly the younger generation.
Yeah, they're very passionate about this, and so they should be. My era in particular, we've spanned both. I've come out at the start of my career, it wasn't a big thing. Now it's huge, and it forms such a central part of everything we're doing in terms of property development and property management. So it's not surprising that if you've got a really smart kid coming out of university now, and they might have a passion on property, but they're also going to have an equally passion about the future of the globe and what that business that I'm going to work for. I'm going to devote a lot of my energy and time and attention to this business. I want to make sure they're taking tangible actions in having an impact on climate.
Just on those young ones coming through today, have they got the patience?
That's a good question. You probably see more of them than we do.
Yeah.
Oh, look, I think they do. I think they just need the alignment. I think that's the biggest difference. There's no doubt that the generation that I was part of coming into an organization, it was almost as if we were thankful that they were giving us a job. and you kind of sat there and smiled and, it felt a lot more one way. Whereas now we've got plenty of young people interviewing us about our credentials for them to take on a role, which I think in some ways is actually really good because it just actually challenges yourself to have a think about it and say, well, what is your proposition, right? It's one thing to have a vision and have a strategy. That's great. But as I said before, it's just as important to have a brand that's aligned with that because people externally to the business don't know what it's like other than what you represent out in the market. But the third part of the triangle is the culture. So if you can't deliver on a promise that for some people they're going to be able to walk in, or for all people, they're going to be able to walk in and say, not only is this business doing something that's meaningful, but I am also part of that, then you've probably got a challenge.
Just on the whole culture and you're communicating the culture, how do you do that as a CEO? It's not the plaque on the wall, surely.
No, it's not. And we spend so much time on it.
Yeah,
we spend a huge amount of time on it, and we have done for over 10 years now.
And is it paying the dividends to spend the time on it?
Definitely. And the way it breaks down, because it's a good question. Culture doesn't exist just by the CEO standing up or sending an email.
A big speech at Christmas time,
correct,
yep.
And telling everyone, hey, we've got a great culture.
That's right.
The only way it sits,
you feel it?
Exactly. The only way it sits is if it comes from the bottom up. They need to tell you what the culture's like,
right? Okay.
And then you as a leader actually have the power to do something about it. So we survey our staff every 2 years, very, very detailed survey. We use sort of an OCI, circumplex.
Yep.
That talks about styles, because what we're really interested in, and then we break it down. So we do get a consolidated view, and this will say, this is Fraser's Property Australia's culture, right, in one circumplex. But then you break it out. You say, what's it like if you're in Melbourne? What's it like if you're in Melbourne in the project development team? What's it like in finance? What's it like in the legal team? What's it like to work for our digital and technology team or our brand team? So the ability to look at it at that level is that it goes to the essence of culture. What is every single person's experience of working at Fraser's Property? Not how I experience it, not how I talk about it, or not how our leaders walk out and say, oh, we've got this great culture, but how does everyone else experience it? So not only surveying it, but then actually putting your money where your mouth is and then having ongoing, detailed conversations around culture, and also meaningful action plans that say, this is what the data tells us. It's telling us that we're actually not as good as we could be in X. That could be communication of, information, or it could be how are we actually celebrating success, or whatever it is that are the elements of culture. If we're not good at those things in certain pockets, what are we going to do about it? How do we fix it?
You happy with the performance of the business now?
Really happy. We've got a great. And look, real estate's cyclical. So the trick with real estate is saying, how do you take a cyclical market and translate it into what is effectively consistent economic and project-based returns? I think that's an advantage for us. We're not listed solely on the Australian Stock Exchange. And that allows us in some ways to be really focused on those project and financial outcomes and less about an annual cycle of earnings. So we will make decisions from time to time that says, that is going to be a 1 or 2 month delay on that sort of thing. And we know that's going to be different to our annual result, but that's the better outcome for either customers or for the long-term value of that project. So we've got a great suite of projects. I couldn't be happier with the culture, especially how it's come through a pretty difficult period and continues to go through a pretty difficult period. An awesome leadership team. So everything says that it's going to be a great future, and I love my job.
I'm just interested, Anthony, in when companies aspire to excel like you do, you've got a great culture and you test it, as you say. When do you break with fit? Because on our side of the fence as search consultants, we get the brief, very detailed brief. We push back, we challenge, we meet your colleagues, we come back to you and challenge you even on your brief. And then often the comment is, look, they've got to be the right fit. Do they? Because if you surround yourself by the same people with the same fit, aren't you ultimately still going to get the same results?
Yeah. It's a really good question.
Is there enough challenging about that? I just sort of wonder sometimes. It's pushed out there, fit.
Yep.
Okay, well, when do you break with that fit if you want to get to different perspectives and some different results?
Totally. It's an awesome question. Fit's quite an intangible element, isn't it?
Yep,
So often...
It's like you're giving me that big speech about the culture, can't you feel it, right?
Correct. So you say, well, who's the judge of fit? That's the other thing. So is it a personal judgment that you think I didn't really click with that person? We know, both of us know, a lot of high performance teams have people that are very different.
Correct.
That would never socialize with each other or are a very almost polar opposites in terms of their views on life, and yet can function very well in a high performance team.
So you're managing a team, but you're managing actually a bunch of individuals.
Yeah, correct. So it's this, and I think it's a mix. I really do think it's a mix. I think the idea of fit's important. It wouldn't stop me bringing someone on board, but I think I would use fit more in my own mind as how they're performing relative to the rest of the business in terms of their interactions, and are they bad for culture, right? Because my view is you can have the highest performer and the smartest person in real estate, but if they're actually decretive to culture, and everyone knows what that means.
Yes.
And again, that's a bit of an intangible, but it just might be the way they talk to people, the way they expect certain things to get done, and that might be out of kilter. That might be a non-fit situation. They're the things you've got to address.
How do you stay ahead of your competition?
We don't necessarily spend too much time analysing what other people are doing.
Is that right?
Yeah, I often think...
Overrated?
Sometimes.
Just focus on your own?
On both sides. So both on a personal level and in a business level. Now, don't get me wrong. It's really important to understand your competitive landscape.
Yep.
And often it's an admiration thing for us because you're seeing some really good property development companies out there doing some really good things. And the industry itself is quite collegiate, but sometimes I think you can overdo it too. So really we've sort of, what I think is pioneered in this space a little bit around that future of connection and how important property is for social cohesion and social connection and the feeling of belonging. That's not something that I have seen in competitors necessarily. We haven't imitated that or done that differently. That's sort of been our own race a little bit, and that's okay. But I guess again, if we had been really fixated just on what everyone else is doing all the time, you probably get stuck in the mud a little bit.
Time to think. When do you take it?
I always create space in my diary, like I block time in my diary, and sometimes thinking is not necessarily big strategic bubbles or
big blue sky,
big innovation stuff. Sometimes it's just going, how will I speak to that person about an opportunity, or how will I do this? So that's all thinking,
Yes.
and it's funny how that leads to different things.
Yes.
The other thing for me is running. So I still run or go to the gym, pretty much most days. And running for me it's happened too many times for it to be a coincidence that I have this clarity of thought while I'm running. And I guess it's potentially meditation by another name.
Yes.
I know a lot of other people do that.
Yep.
So much so that I've actually looked at it, like the neuroscience behind it. There's a lot of neuroscience that backs it up, that's something about the way your body works when it's actually exercising at a high intensity, and how that frees up your clarity of thought. So that's a really good discipline. I find, and I don't do it, I don't preach it. I don't sort of, demand it of others. It's just something I really enjoy doing, and it just always creates space for me to just actually think.
Anthony, what do you need to become a leader?
I love your podcasts that actually address this across the spectrum. And I guess over time, between that and different leadership books, it's one of the most spoken about things. I actually think in my own mind, it can be slightly different for the context. Mm. So you speak to leaders that have variously worked in the fields of war or politics or business or sport.
Yep.
I think it's slightly different, but there are some absolute consistencies. The first would be passion. So not just passion in yourself, having your own passion, but also the ability to inspire passion in others. You need to be able to make decisions. So we spoke about that before.
That's not easy.
It's not easy. That's why I think it's this
you
differentiator.
Think about all the people who don't make decisions.
Absolutely. So you need to be able to make decisions, and that's conviction in yourself and having the right people around you to help you make them. You definitely need perspective, as I said before, and resilience, probably as a flip side of that.
What does resilience mean to you then?
It's just the ability to ride through things. I love that saying. I think various philosophers have claimed it over time, but this too will pass, right? The idea that can you cast forward and look back at yourself in 2 weeks' time or 2 months' time and go, is this really important? So that's resilience to me. It's just having that perspective, being able to take, and that's for good and bad. It's not just about failure. It's not just about, being down and saying, oh, don't worry, it'll get better. It's also about success. Don't overinflate success, right? Because again, cast yourself forward 2 weeks, is that always going to be the case? You definitely need energy. and talent. You know, it's just one of those things. People feed off energy, and I think it's just something people look at, even if it's body language. It's subtle, but people feed off that. And the last would just be around empathy. We spoke about it before, and just being able to listen, put yourself in other people's shoes.
Have you had a coach?
I have.
So what have you done to address? And obviously, you're aspiring one day to be. Well, you must have set yourself a few goals, even though, as you say, you fell forward a lot of times or whatever it is. But no, you're on a path. What's been transformational for you?
Yeah, and when I speak about sort of stumbling into roles, I think you're still always prepared. You're always thinking, you know, and you've always got that awareness of the world and those sorts of things. Yeah. I guess the stumble part is that I just haven't ever had my elbows out and been political about lobbying for a job or strategically positioning myself for the next opportunity. But a coach is awesome, right? Because you're able to sometimes bounce things off a coach that is probably harder to bounce off a colleague or a direct report or something like that. And it can be a bit more philosophical like this. You can actually say, you know, and I've had coaches maybe look at a video that I've done where I've blasted it out to all staff, and staff tell you, "Oh, that was a great video. Thanks for the update." And my coach has said, "No, that's horrible. You did this. Your body language was just all off. I don't think it was authentic the way you presented it. It looked like you might have even been reading what you were saying." You know, those sorts of things are really, really great, authentic feedback to get from people like coaches. Yeah.
Yeah. Communication, so critical.
Super important.
Do you work on that a lot?
All the time. And it's layering.
So you think from what you got in your own toolkit, how much have you had to build?
Quite a lot. I think with people that are reasonably comfortable with leadership, communication probably also comes reasonably naturally to them.
Yep.
The issue is that the bigger the role that you're doing and the more people that kind of sit underneath that role, the harder it is to get that message exactly nuanced in the right way to everybody. People read words differently, people hear words differently. So the biggest thing for me with communication is being able to layer it, to be able to reinforce the messages by people who are naturally more affiliated with their own boss or their own team. Yeah. That's really important. And having that, firstly, clarity in what you're communicating, and then the consistency in that message all the way down through the organisation is critical.
Okay, we haven't come through SARS recently, but we came through another pandemic, COVID. This time you weren't watching the boss, you were the boss. How did you communicate?
Frequently is the first answer.
You're not walking the floor as much?
Not as much. So we introduced much more regular video updates that we would send out. We've got the workplace situation, like so that social media kind of network through the professional network through the organisation. So talking through that, picking up the phone a lot more, having individual conversations, and encouraging all of the other managers and the leaders in the business to do the same thing. And then it was actually listening as well, giving people the opportunity to talk back. So that's the other thing, right? So communication, I think sometimes people tick the box and say, I've told people that, I've told them that, that's very clear. But actually what they're not doing is opening up the other half of communication, which is coming back up the chain. So we were really careful about that. And whether that was through some surveys we were selling to staff, whether it was through open forums where we just said to people, you know, ask us anything. In fact, I was in Brisbane only a couple of days ago and we had a situation, I had a forum where we just had everyone in the business unit.
Yep.
And we had 5 or 6 leaders sitting at the front and just saying, we're not going to present a single slide. We're not going to talk about anything other than what you want to bring up and talk to us about. So there's those sort of elements that say we are authentically trying to communicate both ways.
Okay, now the big $64,000 question out there for every chief exec at the moment. What's the working week going to look like? Everyone's sort of working that one through.
Yeah.
Where are you at?
This is a philosophical question more than it's a strategic question. I think it's going to be different for everyone, is my view. And I think what companies need to do is create a framework so that their teams and the individuals in those teams have enough flexibility to get what they need out of their working week balance, but have enough autonomy to work where they want to work. So the office is nowhere near dead. The central place of working is critical for people. It's about collaboration. It's about opportunities. I often lament the idea during COVID that people at the end of a meeting, when you finish up on Teams and everyone hangs up at the same time, you don't have the opportunity to go and say, I'll have a crack at that. Can I put my hand up and do that? That's how all of us got ahead. It was about having that sidebar conversation or showing that energy and that attitude of, can I get involved in that? That has to continue. So to some degree, and I think it's at least half the week, you need to be sort of thinking about those authentic connections, personal connections. We spoke about how important it is in communities we're building.
Yeah.
It's the same with culture. It's more
Absolutely.
important with culture.
Yep.
But the genie's out of the bottle. We're not going back to 50-hour working weeks, all in the office, all commuting at the same time, and all just focusing on this sort of lemming type attitude to CBDs and whatever. It's going to change a little bit like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just about a balance that people will find
All
themselves.
right. Hardcore. Productivity the same level as it was 12 months ago?
In some ways, productivity is, yes.
Really?
In other ways, we'll only know the difference in a couple of years, right? Because I think the productivity we've had is probably built off established relationships. So we've been able to take money out of the bank.
Yep.
I don't think that would be the same as if in 5 years' time, if nothing changes, if we don't get back into the offices and those places of business and work with each other and foster those relationships and build new connections,
Yep.
that productivity will definitely decrease over time.
Yeah, and I sort of wonder what your thoughts are, Anthony, when you have a team which put forth ideas, right? That's productivity. We're not just building widgets, as you say.
That's right.
And do you miss out on that, or can you still capture it, depending on what you're talking about on the working relationship? That's the hard part.
That's the hard part. And some teams absolutely can.
Yeah.
And this is the other thing about the younger generation.
Yep.
They're a bit more astute around collaboration tools and dynamics and interactions online. And I think in some ways it does democratize a little bit that the hierarchy in an organization if you're on a Teams meeting. But there are those other elements that are a bit intangible, which is people watching leaders, watching how they behave, just drawing down experience from people. Sometimes you can feel experience in a room and you can sort of gravitate to people, and then you can walk outside and ask them a question. Oh, so when you said that, did you actually mean, is this what's really important? So they're those sidebar relationship building type conversations that I believe you can only have in person.
You exhausted?
No, I've got more energy than ever.
What about your team?
Team's tired. The team is tired. It's been an interesting couple of years because even though there's been less travel, less commuting, seemingly more time at home, I think the blurring of that work-life balance has become taxing for people. People naturally gravitating, walking past the computer on the way up to bed at 10 o'clock at night, quickly going on a few more emails. Oh, look, suddenly I'm stuck for another hour.
Yeah.
I'll get up early tomorrow because I don't have to get on the bus. I'm going to quickly go down to my desk. So people are tired. There's no doubt about it. What we need to do as leaders is find those release valves. How do you give people the space and the time and the confidence to be able to go, okay, I need some balance here. And that I think that's just as much about flexibility as the working week.
Anthony, if you were to look back at that young man going into those corridors at PwC all those years ago, what advice would you give him now?
Probably just that it'll all work out well. The way that you are going about things will be fine. I guess sometimes you worry. I guess every young person worries to some degree and probably has a little bit of anxiety about, is that the right thing to do and is that the right job to take and all those sorts of things. So it's nice to sit here now and look back and think, all of that stuff that you maybe didn't need that worry. And I think the other thing too is just enjoy the ride. We spoke to a great leader in our business last year and that was one of the questions we asked. And he's been a very successful CEO in very different businesses in different countries. And one of the things he was asking, the same thing, he said, enjoy the ride. Sometimes you just get so busy looking at that next opportunity, you don't get a chance to just sit still for a minute and actually really enjoy what you're doing at that time. So that's probably the other part.
On that, Anthony, I've enjoyed the ride today. Thank you very much for making the time.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been great to chat, Greg.
You've been listening to No Limitations.